Welcome to PowerTable on Fabric Plan. In this video, we'll walk through automations, a key feature set in PowerTable. Automations let you trigger actions based on specific events inside a PowerTable sheet, executing inserts, updates, or deletes, not just on the connected table, but across all schemas and tables within the connected Fabric SQL database. A single sheet can have multiple automations, each tied to different events. Before we see it in action, let's break down how automations work. Every automation in PowerTable has two parts. The first is the trigger, the event inside the PowerTable sheet that sets the automation in motion. The second is the action set, what the automation actually does once triggered. This can be a single action or a chain of multiple actions, each capable of updating, inserting, deleting, or bulk inserting records, or even running a conditional flow or a repeating loop. Configuring triggers and actions is straightforward. Each automation supports a single trigger. When setting it up, you can add a description and define conditions that the data must satisfy. If those conditions aren't met, the trigger won't fire. Configuring actions works a bit differently. The options vary depending on the action type, but generally you'll specify a description, the database table the action targets, whether it applies to a single record or multiple records, the conditions to identify the records to act on, and the specific values in that table the action will affect. Now let's set up an automation from scratch. We'll use a table containing assets assigned to different employees and build an automation that retires an asset at the click of a button. To set up an automation, navigate to the Setup tab on the toolbar and click Automations. This opens the Automations hub, where you'll find a list of all existing automations. We're starting fresh, so we'll click Create Automation to set one up. Let's rename our automation before we proceed. We want this automation to fire at the click of a button, so we'll set the trigger type to Button Click. We'll add a description, and since this should only fire for assets that aren't already retired, we'll set that rule under the conditions. Next, we'll set up the actions. The first is a Find Records action. This looks up the location information for the asset tied to the button we clicked. We need this to route the asset back to the right IT store, Austin or Denver. We'll start by giving the Find Records action a description. This makes it easy to identify when we reference its results in a later action. Next, we'll specify the schema and table to pull data from, in this case, the Locations table. Finally, we'll set up conditions, so we're only pulling the record that matches the asset whose button we clicked. We do this by leveraging the Location ID from the Locations table against the Location ID of that asset, which we'll be able to pull from the trigger step. Keep in mind that automation steps execute sequentially. Now that we have the asset's location, we need to check whether it's Austin or Denver and route it to the appropriate IT store. For that, we'll add a conditional group. Conditional groups let you branch your action flow based on logic. If a condition is true, one set of actions executes. If it isn't, a different set runs instead. You can also check for multiple conditions if needed. Inside the condition group, we'll add condition blocks. Each one checks a specific condition and runs its own set of actions if that condition is true. Click on a block to configure its rule, then add actions within it. For our first condition, we'll check whether the city returned by the Find Records action is Austin. Next, within this If block, we'll add an Update action to update the record in the Assets table. This action only executes if the city for the selected asset is Austin. As with other actions, we'll specify the schema and table, this time the Assets table. Since this automation is kicked off by a button click on a single row, we only need a single update. To identify the exact row, we'll pull the Asset ID from the button click trigger. Finally, we'll specify the fields to update. We want to clear the assignee and assignment date, set the retirement date to today, move the location to the IT storeroom in Austin, and change the status to retired. That's 5 fields to add and configure. Once the 5 fields are added, we can configure each one individually, either replacing the existing value or clearing it out entirely. The location ID needs the actual storeroom ID. We're hard-coding it here, but you could pull it dynamically with an earlier find action. Similarly, we can add another condition block to check if the asset is in Denver and update the record. Finally, we'll add a catch-all block that runs if no other conditions are met, covering assets that aren't in Austin or Denver, like remote ones. We'll set up an update action here as well and route these assets to the Austin IT storeroom. Now that our automation is set up, let's test it out. First, we'll need to add a button column so we can trigger the automation to retire assets. We'll configure the button column to call an automation and reference the one we just created. With the button column in place, let's try it out by clicking the button on one of these rows. Once we click the button, the automation triggers and completes successfully. Since it executes in the background, all changes are made directly on the database table. A quick refresh of the PowerTable sheet confirms the data has updated and the asset is now retired. For more details on how the automation ran, we can check its run history. Navigate to the Automations hub and look up the run history for this specific automation. The run history shows every execution of that automation, whether it succeeded, when it was triggered, how long it took, and who triggered it. You can also drill into individual steps to see their inputs and outputs, making it easy to debug if something goes wrong. That's automations in PowerTable, from configuring triggers and actions to building conditional logic and verifying execution through run history. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.